My name's Matt Pratton. I'm the Senior Regional Analyst for Europe here at Intelligence Fusion, and today I'll be talking about anti-Semitism across Europe. For anti-Semitic activity, you can usually break it down to rhetoric and incidents. With the monitoring we do, often we'll come across a lot of rhetoric online across various platforms. But in monitoring open sources, we'll come across quite a few examples of incidents on the ground. So what we look at is rhetoric and action. Monitoring it, well, I mean, the internet's a hive of activity. A lot of the time, I'll look at, well, as an open source analyst, I'll try and look at anything that's publicly available. Media reports, press releases from various police departments across the continent. But the treasure trove, I suppose, for anti-Semitic content comes from social media. Facebooks, Twitters, Gabs, Telegrams, and there's a whole lot more than just those ones as well. With tracking online activity, that will first pretty much, when it comes to looking at a threat, you're always trying to determine capability and intent. Online activity, with the ease of communication it provides, that monitoring that online activity provides some really great insights into the intentions of anti-Semitic individuals and groups across Europe. Well, most of the time you can sort of split, but when it comes to the various groups that are anti-Semitic, you can usually divide it right down the middle of left and right-wing extremists. The various groups, when it comes to their online activity, try and, I suppose, think of it as how gangs hold turf. For left-wing extremists, for example, left-wing anti-Semitic groups, the electronic turf for them will be Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, the main ones anyway. For the right-wing anti-Semitic groups, their favourites tend to be Telegram and Gab. But there's also a plethora of other platforms that both groups can use as well. When it comes to rhetoric, the easy part of monitoring anti-Semitism is when it comes to looking at those sort of right-wing anti-Semites. They're the easy ones to keep an eye on because they will say just about anything in order to express hatred of Jewish people and Judaism in general. Their rhetoric will include, but isn't limited to, belief in the blood libel, claims of Jewish people controlling the media, being responsible for wars, or probably the most sinister one is Holocaust denial and even Holocaust support. For left-wing groups, when it comes to their rhetoric, they're a lot more nuanced and a lot more disciplined. Whereas, like, say, groups on the right, for example, these are groups like Der Dritte Weg in Germany or the Nordic resistance movement across Scandinavia. They're openly national socialist. Whereas on the left, it really does require a lot of contextual knowledge because of their discipline and nuance in their rhetoric. It's always important to take a look at not just what they're saying, but also pay attention to what they're not saying. And probably the best example I can provide is when it comes to events in Israel. I mean, while what's happening there is way outside of Europe, what happens there is often the focus for a lot of left-wing anti-Semitic groups across Europe. I suppose the best way I could sum it up when it comes to how left-wing anti-Semitism is expressed is pretty much swap the word Jew or Jewish or the various other derogatory names that right-wing anti-Semites will express about Jewish people and replace that with Israel, and that will be your main lead in identifying anti-Semitic content and rhetoric online. When looking at the action side of things, that's the hardest part. Especially when it comes to trying to match up the rhetoric with actions on the ground. In a lot of the incidents we come across that we log on the Intelligence Fusion platform, a lot of those incidents are carried out by individual actors. There'll be harassment of Jewish people or a lot of vandalism. So targeting of Jewish businesses, synagogues or Holocaust memorial sites or Jewish cemeteries. So it comes to the vandalism, it will largely consist of stars of David or swastikas being sprayed on them. However, there are cases where we do come across instances where individuals will actually be involved with other threats or themes that we look at. For example, in Poland last week, there was an incident where it was an anti-lockdown demonstration in, I believe it was in southern Poland. And in that particular protest, the overall protest was about protesting against government regulations. However, there were two individuals in that protest who were able to essentially get access to a microphone and start making claims that Jewish people were behind the pandemic and all the trouble that has come since. Now, rightly so, those individuals were arrested, and whilst they were at that protest, they didn't represent the majority of people there, and that happens on both the left and the right wing of extremists. So there's some examples we came across of that happening when it comes to sort of the left-wing extremes, left-wing anti-Semitism, with the various protests that occurred across London were largely organised and promoted by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And the protests were huge, and there were several of them. However, amongst the large crowds of people, there were quite a few examples we came across of individuals at those pro-Palestine protests, expressing very, very hostile rhetoric towards Jewish people. In fact, there was the now well publicised one of an individual driving a car throughout the streets of London with loudspeakers on during these protests, calling for the extinction of Israel and calling for the open assault against Jewish women. But I suppose in addition to that, when it comes to the groups do carry out actions, but they're very, very disciplined when they do so, on both sides of the extremes. So on the right, you've got groups like the Right Weg and the Nordic Resistance Movement. These are openly national socialist groups. When they carry out rallies or meetings, they'll be very mindful that they're always being watched by authorities. So they'll go to great lengths to ensure that their actions and rhetoric at their meetings will be, I suppose, just under the threshold of what could be deemed anti-Semitic. And left-wing groups do that. In fact, left-wing anti-Semitic groups are even better at that. These are groups like the various chapters of the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, Palestine Action, or Palestine Solidarity campaigns. When it comes to their protests or even targeting of Jewish businesses, for Palestine Action, for example, Elbit Defence Systems is a particular favourite for them. A lot of their actions are very often, because they're so disciplined, they can easily be deemed as the right to protest. Overall, I don't think there'll be a change in rhetoric. Both left and right-wing extremists will they have plenty at the moment to feed their rhetoric. The left-wing groups, there's what's happening in Israel that they'll continue to focus on. On the right, because they focus on just about anything in order to express hatred of Jewish people, they won't be sport for choice either. Where things could change, I think, though, where there is potential, is for those on the right-wing extremists, for example. They've been taking advantage of a lot of anti-lockdown protests. That could provide a recruiting opportunity for right-wing anti-Semites. It's a very similar situation to what we came across in a previous podcast on policing in Europe. You could see a change in the number of people who start joining these groups, which is a little concerning, because up until, I suppose, the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the right-wing extremists, especially these are your neo-Nazi groups and etc., they've been largely driven underground. I mean, they're out there, but they're such a small presence. But there's currently potential for them to start to emerge again. On the left, they'll continue to have plenty of opportunities. I dare say, when it comes to, should you see incidents in Middle East sort of increase, that's where a lot of activist groups across Europe, that will provide an opportunity for them to increase the tempo of not just their rhetoric, but also protests and direct action. Over time, should there be incidents in the Middle East, you'll see a lot of activism increase, but they'll remain highly disciplined when they do so, in order to avoid being deemed as anti-Semitic. They're trying to prove the actions are anti-Semitic will always be extremely difficult. With the increased opportunities and increased tempo of such protests, there'll be increased potential for individual actors in those protests to emerge, and if it occurs enough, that's where you could start to see evidence of the rhetoric matching the actions on the ground.